We remember that the 1940s and the Cold War was a focus on Europe, so everything else kind of took a back seat. What do we do with Germany? How do we put Germany back together? And everything else is playing second fiddle. In Latin America, the United States, of course, wanted to contain communism from spreading into Latin America, but because Latin America wasn't the primary source of entry for communism in the 40s, we weren't that concerned. We're only going to give about 2% of American foreign aid to Latin American countries during the 1940s, 45 to 49, 50. But most of that aid is just defensive aid going to governments of Latin America. We are going to organize what's called the Rio Treaty, sign the Rio Treaty in 1947. We're going to put together the Organization of American States in 1948. And while these agreements are talking about everybody being like diplomatically equal and nations being sovereign, in reality, for us, they mean we're going to stop the spread of communism. We're going to work to contain communism in Latin America. And so they encouraged Latin American countries to try to stop their own communist movements within. In 1950, the story for the Cold War changes, right? We've got the end of the German question. How do we put Germany back together? The answer, of course, to how to put Germany back together was to split it in two. So after 1948 and 49 and the Berlin blockade, Germany is going to be permanently divided into two. So the Europe question is solved. But even then, it's not going to be a move to Latin America because what takes primary focus in the Cold War in the early 1950s? Very good. Korea. Summer of 1950, North Korea is going to invade South Korea. So that's going to take primary focus for the United States. And so Latin America is still kind of a secondary issue. In 1953, we have a new president coming into office, and that's Dwight David Eisenhower. And we know Eisenhower from his role in the Second World War. Eisenhower is a Republican. He's going to defeat his Democratic challenger, Adlai Stevenson. And he's not going to suffer from the same kind of concerns that the Democratic Party had, that it was being soft on communism. And those concerns were primarily coming from their Republican challengers. When Eisenhower comes to office, he has a new policy to contain communism that is referred to as Eisenhower's New Look. We have talked about the New Look again and again, right? What kinds of things are going to be emphasized in Eisenhower's New Look to contain communism? Yes, Josh, thank you. Okay, brinkmanship, this idea of massive retaliation. Building up our nuclear arsenal, because conventional forces were more expensive, building up our nuclear arsenal, and then using that nuclear arsenal to threaten massive retaliatory strikes if countries step out of line. Do we ever use that policy? Do we ever put that in action? We do, actually. Remember in China, when China in 1953 and again later in 1958 is going to threaten these little islands off the coast of Taiwan called Quemoy and Matsu. China threatens to take these islands and to maybe make a move against Taiwan. And we will use a threat of massive retaliation to get China to back down. Does it work? Of course, because we didn't massively retaliate. So China does back down. So brinkmanship works. So this idea of building up our nuclear arsenal and threatening the use of that nuclear arsenal to get countries to act in the way we want. That's one aspect of the New Look. What's another thing? Very good. We create a new defensive alliance in Asia. We've already got NATO in Europe, and we're going to strengthen NATO under this New Look. West Germany, for example, will be admitted into the NATO alliance. And then we're going to create a new defensive alliance in Asia called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And then we're going to use that CIA. The CIA, which was born in the late 1940s under that National Security Act we've long talked about, the CIA was an intelligence-gathering outfit. It's meant to gather foreign intelligence to better advise United States officials. Eisenhower is going to use that CIA, and it's going to grow the CIA, begin to use it for covert operations. Covert operations from the CIA far cheaper than direct military confrontations. So we're going to use that CIA to try to influence anti-communist or pro-American forces. All right? And we're going to see that CIA and these covert operations first take shape in Latin America in the country of Guatemala. Guatemala is going to have a democratic election that brings a new president named Arbenz, A-R-B-E-N-Z. You can see his name here on this big billboard. New president into Guatemala in 1952. And this new president of Guatemala, while he was democratically elected, is going to be making some promises to the people of Guatemala that the United States is not too cool with. Because this is a problem that's been growing in Latin American countries. There's only so much aid the United States can give to foreign countries. This is all a part of what the United States, or what we refer to in our budgets, and you don't have to write this down, just hear it, as discretionary spending. In your family's budget, there are things that they have to spend every month, and then there are things that are at their discretion to spend. You've got to pay the rent, or you've got to pay the mortgage. You've got to pay your car bill, right? You've got to pay your insurance. But after you've paid those necessities, then we have a lot of choices. With whatever money you have left, you could save it. You could invest it. You could go to see movies. You could go on a vacation. You could do whatever it is you want. You can buy a new fancier car. Dad can get a motorcycle. Whatever's going on with your life. You can spend your money on those things. That's discretionary spending. For our nation, we have some spending that is prescribed by law we have to spend. Like the American government cannot decide to not spend on Social Security. We can't decide, Donald Trump can't decide on his own to not send money for Medicare payments or Medicaid payments or whatever. These are statutory laws. These are laws that direct this spending, and we have no say about it year to year. Unless the laws change. You'd have to get the laws to change, and then you can maybe change how that stuff is spent. Then there's discretionary spending, and discretionary spending is a much smaller component of our overall budget. It's hardly anything left over. But that is the stuff that's up to an individual president and Congress to approve on spending. So our military spending is discretionary spending. Spending that we might do to support our national parks or environmental regulatory spending. This is all discretionary spending. You guys have heard a lot of kerfuffle since Donald Trump became president, probably. Kerfuffle, it's a word that Jeff and I probably use to mean people getting a little out of sorts, people getting frustrated or angry, right? Donald Trump ran for president and won that election, and now he's president of the United States, and he's talking about changing some of the ways we spend some of that discretionary spending. What does Donald Trump want to do to military spending? He wants to increase it. Spend more, $54 billion more on our military. And as such, because he wants to keep the budget balanced, he needs to decrease $54 billion in other spending. Some of that was targeted at the Environmental Protection Agency, some targeted at Department of Energy programs. There's various, Department of Education is looking to get some cuts. There's various cuts amounting to 54. This is discretionary. This is what a president gets to do when he's elected. He can change the spending plans for this discretionary spending. All right? Well, the United States only has so much discretionary spending every year that it can do. So there's a finite pot of this money that can be spread around. And with regard to Latin America, since the beginning of the Cold War, there's only so much money that could go to Latin America. Some of it going to Latin America was in the form of military aid going to Latin American countries. Especially after World War II, when we had a lot of weapons sitting around after the war, that's primarily the aid that's going. Many in the United States advocated that we should be sending more developmental aid to Latin America rather than just military aid. Money that they can build their infrastructure with and strengthen their economies with. Military aid doesn't really strengthen anyone's economy, but developmental aid might. I want you to think of Europe. The difference between military aid and developmental aid is the difference really between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, of which we did both in Europe, right? The Truman Doctrine was like direct military aid to what two countries initially? Greece and Turkey, very good. And then the Marshall Plan was that developmental aid. The Marshall Plan was the funding for strengthening the economies of countries like France and Italy and Britain to avoid. Think of the lawn example we gave you at the beginning of the year, right? I'm looking at the dandelions all over my lawn, and oh my gosh, you guys were all so cute when you were little tiny, and you picked the dandelions, and your moms and dads looked at you and you blew, and now I just see those seeds blowing around, and there are going to be more dandelions for me to worry about. We can do the Truman Doctrine against these dandelions, right? The Truman Doctrine against the dandelions is me doing what? Help me out here. Truman Doctrine means like direct military aid, right? So for dandelions, what does Truman Doctrine mean? You're literally bending over and ripping them out, or you're getting the Roundup and you're squirting them to kill those dandelions wherever they pop up. The Marshall Plan is what for the lawns? What is the Marshall Plan? Yes.
Pump money into other countries so they don't have the need to actually go come.
To pump money into my lawn, so the weeds never have a chance to show themselves. You've got to fertilize that lawn, and you've got to really put a lot of effort and time and energy into strengthening that lawn, so the weed seeds that might get down in there can't even pop through the seed of light of day, right? What is by far more difficult and expensive in the long run? Bending over and pulling out weeds, or funding the construction of a thick, lush lawn? What's the harder thing to do? The funding the thick lawn. That's why if you let things go, you end up with weeds. If you take care of it from beginning to end, you have that thick lawn that can avoid them. We are doing far more Truman Doctrine to Latin America, sending in military aids to governments, than we are economic development to Latin America. Everyone cool with that? All right, beautiful.